Sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink. Now you're in the sunken place.
I started watching cable. I was watching Poltergeist last month. I got a question. Why don't white people just leave the house when there's a ghost in the house?
It's like an Eddie Murphy bit. This idea of like, if black people were in, the leads of a horror movie, it would go very differently.
Oh, baby, this is beautiful. We got a chandelier hanging up here, kids outside playing. It's a beautiful neighborhood. We ain't got nothing to worry. I really love them. This is really nice.
He hears, "Get out."
Too bad we can't stay, baby.
It turns out everybody, whatever race you are, everybody wants the main character to do the smart thing.
I felt this feeling that everyone in the theater was Chris. Everyone is looking through the same set of eyes.
The movie Get Out stars Chris, a black photographer from Brooklyn who visits his girlfriend Rose's family in upstate New York. His first night there, Rose's mom, Missy Armitage, pressures Chris into a hypnotherapy session, seemingly to cure his smoking addiction. During the hypnosis, Chris reveals that as a child, his mom died in a hit-and-run accident, and he feels responsible for her death because he didn't call for help. Instead, for reasons he doesn't understand, he watched TV and did nothing, and he feels that same motionlessness during the session with Missy.
You can't move.
Why can't I move?
You're paralyzed. Just like that day when you did nothing.
Now frozen, Missy tells him to sink into the floor, revealing one of the most iconic movie moments of all time, the sunken place. Writer-director Jordan Peele originally came up with the sunken place when he thought about the phenomenon when you're about to go to sleep, but then you feel like you're falling and catch yourself.
I always thought to myself, what if you didn't catch yourself? What if you didn't wake up? Where would you fall to?
But after he wrote the scene, he realized that clearly wasn't the whole story.
I really started noticing the parallels to the prison industrial complex. Black men are essentially abducted at a completely disproportional rate.
Chris is part of a system. His father was never really around. Fathers not being around is an epidemic in the black community. My father wasn't around. Tossing black men to the back of their minds, literally and figuratively. The sunken place is a metaphor for that.
The sunken place itself perfectly captures the feeling of helplessness that Peele was going for. Chris completely loses his agency. He can still perceive reality, but that reality is physically removed from him, and his screams cannot be heard. This metaphor for the loss of agency proved so powerful that, after the release of Get Out, it entered common lexicon. Someone in the sunken place now describes any disadvantaged person unwilling or unable to acknowledge the systemic issues affecting them.
I originally felt like it was black people, but I've had many people, women, many people of all different races tell me they've felt that, a feeling of the voiceless.
I think the sunken place has remained so iconic because it captures a distinct feeling from deep within our collective psyche. Something you've definitely felt, but have maybe never put into words. A psychological phenomenon felt by black men and women, by those without a voice, and by you, watching this video.
You live in the sunken place.
In his iconic book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Sigmund Freud identifies one of the core symptoms of trauma, the need to, quote, repeat as a current experience what is repressed, instead of, as the physician would prefer to see them do, recollecting it as a fragment of the past. In movies, we see this phenomenon most clearly in the traumatic flashback, where a film cuts from the present day to a character's past traumatic experience, which we then relive alongside them. Throughout Sergio Leone's famous 1968 western Once Upon a Time in the West, the main protagonist plays a harmonica, but it's not until the final showdown that we realize why. As he faces his nemesis Frank, we cut to the main character as a child, and we realize that Frank forced him to kill his older brother, and then Frank gave him that harmonica. Through a cut to the past, we understand the emotional turmoil the character constantly goes through in the present when he uses the harmonica. This kind of cut gives a past event the visceral feeling of a current experience. Through editing, we eliminate the distinction between past and present. We can feel the urgency of this kind of cut when we compare it to a fade-in, which does make the memory feel distant. Because movies are an audio-visual medium, they feel uniquely suited to portray what an actual flashback feels like. Showing the past and present side by side mimics the way we all feel intrusive thoughts, which hijack the senses and, in the most extreme cases, force the victim to relive the past. And Get Out uses this exact technique when Chris has the opportunity to save Georgina in a way he couldn't with his mother.
Show him as a kid and show Georgina one last time, to sort of signify this connection of like, if he doesn't get her now, he's never going to beat his demon.
And The Sunken Place takes this idea of reliving the past one step further. Instead of a montage of shots that still moves the viewer forward in time, The Sunken Place removes the viewer from time altogether. If we consider The Sunken Place through Freud's description of trauma, the place becomes an extreme version of that repetition of the past. Jordan Peele has said that everyone's sunken place would look different depending on their past traumatic experience. In Chris's sunken place, we see the world only through a small rectangle, just like the TV he watched when he was frozen as a kid, and he does the exact same scratching with his hands. So the terror of The Sunken Place is that it's not just a flashback that comes and goes, it is the never-ending feeling of being literally trapped in a past event, the actual hijacking of your present. This metaphor feels so much closer to what reliving a past event feels like than a simple cut. Like Freud, Jordan Peele is clearly onto something, yet the resonance of The Sunken Place goes beyond Freud's idea of trauma as a repetition of the past. The Sunken Place also shows us what can make a past event so difficult to come to terms with.
Open your eyes.
Since Freud published his original theories on trauma, scholars have expanded further on what makes a past event, like Chris's in Get Out, so difficult to resolve. In her book Unclaimed Experience, Professor Kathy Carruth points out that it's not just that the event was intense or disturbing. It also has to be something that, quote, is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known. Consider how the movie Encanto portrays the exact same event, both with and without trauma. The opening of the movie gives the classic exposition we've seen in countless Disney movies. Abuela tells the story of her husband dying and the family gaining the miracle of the candle, which gives them their magical home. The story focuses on magic and spectacle and uses soothing music and gradual fades to make the event feel like a well-understood, distant memory. We hardly see anything disturbing. The destruction of their former home is only hinted at off-screen. And when her husband dies, he simply fades away. And we're reminded that through this tragedy, the family received something great. Contrast this telling with the exact same event shown later in the movie, after we learn that Abuela has in fact not yet come to terms with what happened.
I've never been able to come back here.
In this flashback, we get to see the cinematic techniques that make an event feel traumatic, something experienced too unexpectedly to be fully known. Instead of gradual fade-ins, we get harsh cuts, a shaky camera, and tilted angles. We see the violence firsthand instead of just hints of it, and the story lingers on the suffering, positioning the soldiers at a high angle with Abuela looking powerless. And crucially, Mirabel exists inside of the memory itself. Both she and the viewer have been hijacked from the present and forced to relive the past through Abuela's eyes. And it feels the same as if it were a current experience happening right now, right in front of us. In that original telling, we get a simple story that makes sense. It neatly explains the current magical situation of La Familia Madrigal. But in this second telling, we feel the uncertainty of the event, that maybe the miracle doesn't fully protect Abuela from the pain and suffering she went through, and that past pain hasn't been fully addressed or acknowledged. Through this retelling, Encanto challenges the familiar Disney construct that the past simply becomes myth, and instead shows how myth-making can actually prevent generational trauma from being addressed. Sometimes a story is too simple and too familiar, which, in the case of Encanto, literally hides the cracks within the foundation. Carruth points out why Freud turns to literature to explain trauma, because, quote, like psychoanalysis, literature is interested in the complex relationship between knowing and not knowing. In other words, literature and storytelling more broadly doesn't always give simple answers to the central conflict, and in doing so, storytelling provides the same profound ambiguity that makes traumatic events seemingly impossible to make sense of. And movies, like all art, provide that same insight.
I can't tell you, because I don't know.
In Encanto, Abuela latches onto the miracle to safeguard her from her pain. But when unknowns appear, like Bruno's vision and Mirabel's lack of a gift, they expose the uncertainty beneath the flimsy narrative we saw in the beginning of the movie. The conflict in Encanto provides a perfect example of why Kathy Carruth calls her book Unclaimed Experience, because that's what trauma is. A past event that hasn't yet been incorporated into a reliable narrative, one that hasn't been claimed, leaving behind an event that is not fully understood and re-enters the past through uncontrollable flashbacks. Unresolved past experiences, large and small, feel bound in this phenomenon of the unclaimed experience. In Get Out, Chris hasn't gotten over the death of his mom, but the real trauma, like all trauma, is not simply in the tragic event, but in his not knowing.
I just sat there.
You didn't call anyone?
No.
Why not?
I don't know.
And that's how Missy gets Chris into his sunken place. Like with all her victims, she places him into that limbo of knowing and not knowing. Knowing something is wrong, yet not knowing why he did nothing.
You're paralyzed. Just like that day when you did nothing. You did nothing.
So it's no surprise that the sunken place is designed to make Chris look powerless. Not only can he not move while in the real world, but his screams in the sunken place cannot be heard. We instead look down on him at an extreme high angle, and, like Abuela in Encanto, he tries and fails to reach out and stop it.
I came here to see you. Because I know that now you'll tell me what you're after.
One of the biggest appeals of film is the promise of resolving one's own trauma. In Once Upon a Time in the West, the harmonica symbolizes the protagonist's inability to move on from his brother's death. But after the final showdown with Frank, he gives the harmonica back, showing he successfully got his revenge and beat his demons. And in Get Out, Chris gets a similar opportunity to overcome his trauma when he has the chance to save Georgina. Having a character act on their past traumatic memory gives them what psychologist Pierre Janet called the pleasure of completed action. The act allows them to approach and resolve a traumatic event on their own terms. They can claim the previously unclaimed experience and apply it to their own narrative. It's a classic element of the hero's journey, so it's no surprise that this narrative is so popular in storytelling. It creates a strong narrative arc and fulfills the fantasy that one can overcome their demons. Even in really intense and gruesome stories, a sense of agency can provide that narrative fulfillment. Throughout the movie Saving Private Ryan, we see many deaths that seem to have been for nothing, like when soldiers drown or when a soldier gets killed while a medic tries to save him. Unlike Once Upon a Time in the West, these deaths feel unjustifiable. Not only do they happen at random, but they do nothing to help the war effort or drive the story forward. It makes sense that the movie did trigger PTSD for combat veterans, because it is full of moments that Freud described as a, quote, experience of helplessness. These moments feel like unclaimed experiences because they don't fit into any meaningful narrative. And it's not just in the violence that we feel the meaninglessness of war. When the soldiers begin their mission to find Private Ryan and bring him home, they similarly don't understand why they're risking their lives for just one person. And throughout the movie, many of their actions do end up just wasting time and risking lives. Even the soldiers' personal lives contain elements of the unclaimed experience. One textbook traumatic moment comes from the character Irwin Wayne, who as a kid pretended to be asleep so his mom wouldn't talk to him. After he shares that story, he says,
I don't know why I did that.
Exactly like Chris in Get Out, Irwin doesn't understand why he remained motionless and ignored his mom. And it's precisely through Irwin's not knowing, through the constant senseless violence, and through the seemingly meaningless mission to save Ryan, that the events of Saving Private Ryan feel traumatic and unclaimed. And even Ryan himself, shown as an older man at the beginning and end of the film, still looks traumatized from his past experience. But despite all these traumatic moments, the movie tries to give itself a simple, patriotic narrative. First, the movie places the seemingly pointless violence within a larger context. Towards the end of the movie, we get a voiceover of a letter written to Ryan's mom by a World War II general, which states that the war was a campaign against tyranny and oppression, and that the sacrifices weren't for nothing.
And the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom.
This poetic rationale turns unexplainable present experiences into past, justifiable actions. Through this speech, the film tells the audience why the violence had to happen. And second, the movie gives Ryan himself the agency to incorporate his experience into his own narrative. Captain Miller commands Ryan to earn the sacrifices they all made for him. And when we go back to the present day, Ryan wants to know if his wife thinks he did exactly that.
Tell me I have led a good life.
She assures him that he did, and that does seem to be the case. Ryan has his conventional white bread family with him. We hear the patriotic music in the background, and he honors his experience by saluting Captain Miller's tombstone. Through this ending, the movie tells us that World War II was not an unclaimed experience because it gave Americans like Ryan the freedom or the agency to live a good life. A life where traumatic experiences can actually inspire you instead of leaving you sunken. But war is rarely that simple. What would it look like if a World War II movie did the opposite?
昭和20年9月21日夜、僕は死んだ。
The movie Grave of the Fireflies is a Japanese animated movie following the lives of two siblings, Seija and Setsuko, trying to survive in World War II Japan. Like Saving Private Ryan, the film begins and ends with the same scene, and the middle is a flashback of their experience during World War II. But unlike Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene shows Seija dying all alone shortly after the war. Seija is not supported or respected like Ryan, but rather called disgusting and disgraceful. His death is one of the many seemingly meaningless deaths caused by war. Unlike Ryan, Seija did not earn anything, and the ending scene isn't reality but rather a dreamlike fantasy of a happy reunion that never occurred in real life. So unlike Saving Private Ryan, the war itself has no meaning to Seija, to the point where he doesn't even know the war has ended until much later. A clear reminder that even though the war has actually ended, he is still stuck in the past, not knowing what all the violence was even for. The end provided no relief to Japanese civilians, whose homes and families are still completely destroyed, whereas Saving Private Ryan reminds us that some American soldiers like Ryan got to go back home inspired to live a good life. In the opening scene of Grave of the Fireflies, a dreamlike Seija stands against a dark background and watches his real-life equivalent die in a train station. It feels all too familiar to the Sunken place. He's not in control of his story. He can only watch himself from a distance, unable to reach out and stop it. Periodically on Reddit, someone will ask a question like, what is a movie you can only watch once? What you end up with is essentially a list of movies where the central trauma is left unclaimed. Movies like Requiem for a Dream, Manchester by the Sea, and unsurprisingly, Grave of the Fireflies. All these movies' endings leave the viewer with the harmonica. They leave the viewer in an unclaimed experience they cannot escape from. They leave them in the sunken place. And I think a movie like Saving Private Ryan would get added to this list if its beginning and ending changed. What if Ryan was more like Tom in Hacksaw Ridge, and like many actual traumatized veterans, visiting his fellow soldiers' tombstones unhappy and alone? Movies like Get Out, Encanto, and Grave of the Fireflies show the impossibility of turning a traumatic experience into a neat linear narrative. It's sometimes impossible to reduce a past event, because to do so would erase the emotional truth of what happened. So the act of trying to turn trauma into a neat narrative can itself be painful. In the movie Hiroshima Mon Amour, a French woman describes her love affair with a German soldier during World War II. She planned to elope with him, but he died on the same day France was liberated. When her parents found out about the affair, they locked her in a cellar where she went mad. Once she shares the story with her Japanese lover in Hiroshima, she feels she has betrayed her own trauma.
Je t'ai trompé ce soir avec cet inconnu. J'ai raconté notre histoire. Elle était, vois-tu, racontable.
Where were you when she died?
I don't want to think about that.
The reason you haven't told her this is because you don't want the woman you love to know that you are the type of person who abandons your family.
In the hesitancy of these characters to speak of their past, we understand why trauma is so difficult to put into a story. Movies give events a beginning, middle, and an end, but unclaimed experiences are experienced not as a story, but rather a non-stop disruption that begins out of nowhere and feels like it'll never end. In other words, the French woman's past feels like the sunken place, a place she and Chris enter without their control, and a place that they cannot escape.
Everyone's room in Sunken Place would look different.
La cave est petite, très petite. La société me roule sur la tête, au lieu du ciel. Je la vois marcher, cette société. Elle ne sait pas que je suis dans la cave. Les mains deviennent inutiles dans les caves. Elles grattent. Elles s'écorchent au mur. À se faire saigner.
You're so scared. You think it was your fault?
Puis un jour, tout à coup, je crie très fort, comme une sourde.
When Chris screams, we don't hear it. When he's in the sunken place, we don't hear it. I went to this idea of like, what's worse than death? And of course, this feeling of being trapped in your own body for eternity.
Combien de temps?
L'éternité.
Everyone is looking through the same set of eyes.
It's some fucked up dreams.
What'd you dream?
I was in a hole or something, and I couldn't move.
How are you?
I don't know, how are you?
I don't know.
In the movie Manchester by the Sea, Lee Chandler mistakenly starts a fire in his house that kills his 3 children. Later in the movie, he has a dream where he sees his kids, and one of them says,
"Didn't you see me burning?"
This scene directly references a story told in the 7th chapter of Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, where a father also has a dream where his son asks him, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" The father then awakens to realize that a candle had fallen on and burned the body of his dead child, who had recently died of a fever. And in Manchester by the Sea, Lee also awakens to a burning, except his burning is the burning of sauce on the stove. Freud told this story to introduce a question about dreaming. Why would the father even stay asleep and dream of his child instead of instantly waking up to stop the burning? According to Freud, the father wanted a way to see his child alive, which Freud described as wish fulfillment, satisfying a desire through some involuntary thought process, such as a dream, even if that fulfillment prevents the dreamer from acting in real life. And that's exactly what happens to Chris when he stays to watch TV instead of trying to get help for his mom. It's a form of wish fulfillment.
I was just watching TV.
And I'd be watching the television and remember asking myself, why? I'm not doing anything. I'm just watching the TV. I'm letting this contraption sort of offer me a way out of my responsibilities.
Chris's denial of that harsh reality creates a psychosis that Missy weaponizes into the sunken place. And the sunken place does feel very dreamlike, especially since Peele did originally associate the sunken place with the feeling of falling when trying to sleep. So Freud's theory of wish fulfillment answers Chris's unanswerable question of why he did nothing to help his mom. The answer is that facing the possibility of a dying mom is simply too much for a child to bear, something too unexpected, what Kathy Carruth calls a lack of preparedness. And the only safe response is to remain stuck in wish fulfillment, unwilling and unable to face reality. And all these movies contain elements of wish fulfillment. Characters initially deny some part of their experience, such as by living in a dreamlike fantasy, by overlooking the clear warning signs, or by rejecting reality entirely.
No, honey. You're not burning.
So through this lens, the sunken place is a place that visualizes this universal feeling of being stuck. The feeling of wanting to move, to make noise, to feel grounded, but instead being trapped in a headspace that keeps you suspended in air, in a nightmare-like state, trapped in a perpetual state of wish fulfillment. Which begs the most important question of all. How do we escape the sunken place? In Get Out and in The Interpretation of Dreams, escaping the sunken place is just as important as the sunken place itself. Psychologist Jacques Lacan felt that the idea of waking up plays a huge role in how we understand trauma. Where Freud asked why we dream, Lacan asked why do we awaken? When the child asks, "Don't you see I'm burning?" Lacan sees the question as a command for the father to leave the dream and confront reality. In Manchester by the Sea, the obvious reason for Lee to awaken is to stop the burning on the stove. But the act of awakening also affects him in a deeper way. It forces him to confront the reality that his trauma is not resolved, that he has to go back to Boston, because at least there he's in more control, even if it's as simple as being able to invite his nephew.
So you can come visit sometime.
So it's no coincidence that Lee makes the arrangements for his nephew in the scene immediately after the dream. Using the language of Jacques Lacan and Sigmund Freud, we can see that the act of awakening from Lee's dream is what ended his state of wish fulfillment, allowing him to accept the unbearability of his trauma. Fully aware of the reality of his situation, he can finally admit why he can't stay in Manchester.
I can't beat it.
So awakening from the dream becomes the opposite of wish fulfillment. Instead of staying in a state of denial, waking up allows the dreamer to acknowledge the truth of their trauma, to, as Carruth puts it, bear witness to their trauma in some way, shape, or form. But getting out of our sunken places is not always as simple as awakening from the dream. For Chris in Get Out, and for all of us, it's more complicated.
It's weird that scene, I mean, Judah did say on set, yo, this is iconic.
Did he say that?
He said that on set. I know he said that on set.
In the annotated screenplay for Get Out, Jordan Peele describes how Chris uses photography to awaken himself from his trauma. It became this perfect defense mechanism for Chris, specifically in the party scene. He gets uncomfortable and says,
I'm gonna take some pictures.
his trauma ties into his profession. For somebody who had been through the worst day of his life when his mom died and was in the stasis while watching television, it would make sense that he chose photography. He's freezing moments and collecting them. This ability to step back and investigate through a telescopic lens. From this angle, photography is the antithesis of the sunken place. Instead of being forced to watch the world through a rectangle, Chris controls the rectangle himself. He can move and preserve his memories instead of being stuck in them. When we first enter Chris's apartment in the beginning of Get Out, we get a series of his own photographs. One shows a pregnant black woman and a man walking away from her. The staging in this picture reflects Chris's own upbringing as a child raised by a single mother without a father.
Chris's father, whether he was literally in prison or not, there is a relevance with the idea of the disappearance of black men.
So through his art, Chris literally captured the trauma of his childhood. Chris's childhood trauma is not fully resolved, yet, like Lee in Manchester by the Sea, he does manage to bear witness to and memorialize his trauma, in his case, through photographing the black experience. And this ability to investigate the world around him reflects Chris's general perceptiveness, which Peele emphasizes with the song in the background of this scene.
It's talking about stay woke, which I needed the whole audience to understand that the lead character, Chris, is woke. He's not an idiot. He's alert. He's going to be making the right decisions.
The phrase "stay woke" has multiple meanings in the context of Get Out. The most obvious reason is what Jordan Peele himself said. He wanted to create a horror movie with a woke, black protagonist, someone smarter than the white people Eddie Murphy described in horror movies. Not only does Chris know when he's in danger, but he's also woken up to greater systemic issues. He understands the racial undertones beneath the seemingly innocuous comments made by the Armitage family and the guests at the party. But in Get Out, there's another more literal meaning to staying woke. When Chris gets trapped in the sunken place, he's stuck in a dreamlike trance. So the term also relates to the sunken place itself. Like the phrase "get out," stay woke is a command for Chris to avoid the sunken place and go back to being that in-control, smart protagonist. And Chris isn't the only character to lose his wokeness, both literal and figurative, when he enters the sunken place. In the opening scene, Andre Hayworth starts off savvy and self-aware like Eddie Murphy, understanding his lack of safety in a white suburb.
About to go the other way. I can't. Not today. Not me.
Very simple. It's a ghost in the house. Get the fuck out.
You know how they like to do motherfuckers out here, man. I'm gone.
But once Andre becomes sunken with the brain of a white man, he's no longer self-aware. He's instead trapped in whatever traumatic dream Missy Armitage constructed for him, living a wish fulfillment fantasy that he's in no danger.
I find that the African-American experience for me has been, for the most part, very good.
The ghost told them to get out the house. White people stayed in there. Now that's a hint and a half for your ass.
It is only after Chris uses his phone to awaken Andre from the sunken place that Andre utters the title of the movie, the command to avoid the sunken place, the command to stay woke.
Get out.
Sorry, man.
Okay. Get out!
According to Peele, it's no coincidence that a camera flash is what awakens Andre and Walter out of their sunken places. As we were making the movie, I realized the implications of camera phones and how they've become such an important tool in the fight against racism. It's connected to this idea of his eyes and point of view as a black man being his special power. He's equipped to know something fucked up is going on because he's perceptive. His eyes, his art, his point of view. It's his weapon. In this context, the term wokeness applies not just to awakening from a dream, but also to awakening to the racism in the world around us. In Get Out and in Unclaimed Experience, wokeness is the explicit denial of a kind of sleep. It is the demand to leave a wish fulfillment dream and wake up to reality. A reality where one confronts trauma, both individual and collective. Chris uses a camera to awaken people from their sunken place literally, through a flash camera, and metaphorically, by using photography to acknowledge the systemic issues Chris faces as a black man. And Jordan Peele does the exact same thing as a filmmaker. Through his implementation of the sunken place, he forces the audience to bear witness to the collective trauma inflicted on black Americans through the abduction and appropriation of their bodies.
So let's go to the sunken place.
Not everybody who resonated with Get Out is a black person in America, and not everyone who resonated with The Sunken Place has experienced the trauma of feeling responsible for their own mother's death. And yet, The Sunken Place is a visual representation of something we have all felt: the disruption of our own narrative, the loss of understanding, our entrapment in a past with no escape. And it's a feeling touched on in countless other works of art. The movie Get Out uses it to comment on black male enslavement, the prison industrial complex, and white people appropriating black bodies. Jordan Peele used an all too familiar feeling so that, when Chris gets hypnotized,
everyone is looking through the same set of eyes. The movie was bringing people together as opposed to tearing us further apart. That to me teaches me a ton about the power of story.
Trauma is not easily resolved. Sometimes it's never fully resolved. It's not like Missy's hypnosis actually cured Chris of his past, and now Chris has to deal with that new traumatic experience in the Armitage house, another sudden violent event. Get Out shows us that we can't always get revenge on the bad guy, or team up to fight some straightforward cause. There's no easy narrative when trying to address trauma on the individual or systemic level. And that's what all these movies about trauma accomplish. They show the difficulty and necessity of acknowledging trauma as it truly exists, and that what matters most is expressing our issues, even if they can't yet be fully resolved. And that's the beauty of The Sunken Place. It's the ultimate metaphor for what an unresolved past event feels like. And by seeing that feeling expressed in a movie, Get Out wakes us all up. It bridges our own unclaimed experiences, our own feelings of not knowing, with those felt by Chris. There's probably something you're struggling with, and what Sigmund Freud and Jordan Peele and Kathy Kruth have taught me is, don't rush into turning your problem into some neat narrative. Simply to acknowledge it, to express what's actually there. Sometimes that's brave enough. So when I look at The Sunken Place, I see what storytelling is capable of. And I see a reminder that you've got to use art to help escape your sunken place, to get you out of your motionless wish fulfillment, to use your eyes in this moment, so that now you see it.